Good morning again. Ephesians chapter 6. We were just reading a few moments ago. I'll ask you to turn there as we continue our study from the book of Ephesians. Last week we talked about relationships, and I thought how timely as we're studying through Ephesians, because this is a season where sometimes relationships are tested. Case in point, if you happen to live in Korea, if you're Kim Jong-un, you just lost an uncle last week because relationships. You may have been watching the news. He did away with his uncle. Didn't like him. I don't know if it had anything to do with the holidays, but it has a whole lot to do with what we're talking about. Probably this morning you woke up with any number of things on your mind, but not what I'm going to talk about this morning, which are about two superpowers. You probably thought about, what am I going to get ready to wear, or where are we going to eat after church, or any number of things, but probably not superpowers. No, I'm not talking about the Hulk or Superman or Spider-Man, but I'm talking about what we just read from in Ephesians chapter 6. Now, as Paul is wrapping up this letter, he's writing by inspiration. He's writing, I think, at the conclusion, because God says, I want you to save this till the end. And I think Paul's in total agreement because of the background that he's had in dealing with Satan and only making it by the grace of God. And so the two go hand in hand as he talks about these two powers. Most of the time, this passage from Ephesians 6, verses 10 through 20, is read and discussed and divided up among the different things described as the Christian armor and the things we should have. And we'll mention those things along the way. But I think you can miss the forest for the trees, the items there. Because as Paul's starting this out, he says, finally, brethren, after all these things we're talking about in this letter, the issues of Christianity, the issues of walking with Christ, the issues of relationships, the issues of matrimony, and all these things, and husbands and wives, and kids and children, and working in the world, all of these things, finally, brethren, this is the culmination of it. Be strong in the Lord and in the power of His might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood. And if you're reading it there, that's what it's saying if you're reading especially the RSV. But against the principalities, against the powers, against the rulers of the world of darkness, against the principalities of heavenly hosts. God starts out by talking here through Paul's words about these two powers. The power of the Lord and the power of Satan. You probably didn't think about those this morning. Now maybe you got up this morning and you had some time to pray. I hope you did. And so you thought about one of those powers. The need for God. Maybe particularly you're mindful of some people that really were struggling. Might be in your family. I look at it and I know some that are. In all likelihood, you got up and prayed this morning. And you prayed fervently for some things. Things that you're wrestling with, or some close friends or people at Central are dealing with. And you are very mindful of their need of God in their life. But as Paul's talking about this, he says, I want you to understand your need for the Lord in your life, because Satan is out there. Now, before I talk about the Lord and the power and the need for that, I want you to get a good grasp of what God's talking about here. When he deals with this idea of principalities and powers and rulers of darkness. Turn to Mark chapter 5 for just a moment. As we page back now just a little bit in history to the time that Jesus is walking on the earth, not many years after the writing that Paul writes. And we encounter here of an individual in chapter 5 of Mark who is demon-possessed. Mark writes it like this in chapter 5, verse 1. Then they, that's Jesus and his disciples, they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gadarenes. Some of your translations may say Gerasenes, depending on the manuscript that actually used. And when he come out of a boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit, demon possession, who had his dwelling among the tombs, and no one could bind him, not even with chains, because he'd often been bound with shackles and chains, I guess in more of the subdued state, whether he slept or just kind of maybe somewhat relaxed. And the chains had been pulled apart by him, and the shackles broken in pieces, not just worked his way loose, but just ripped him to shreds. Neither could anyone tame him. He couldn't be controlled. Not emotionally, not mentally, not physically. Power. This is his habitat, verse 5. And always, night and day, he was in the mountains and in the tombs, crying out and cutting himself with stones. And when he had saw Jesus from afar, he ran and he worshipped him, and he cried out with a loud voice and said, "What have I to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High? I implore you, by God, that you do not torment me." For he had said to him, "Come out of the man, unclean spirit." Then he'd ask him, "What is your name?" And he answered, saying, "My name is Legion, for we are many." I feel like sometimes that we have these legions upon us, troubling us, attacking our family here at Central. Satan has not stopped. When you read the rest of this story, Jesus, because of the request of the demon, cast this legion of demons out, and they go into a herd of swine, 2,000 of them. And the swine rush down the steep of the hill and off into the lake and drown themselves. Power. Let's turn another chapter here in chapter 7, or chapter 9 rather, of Mark, just a couple pages over. Verse 14. And when he, that is Jesus capturing the context here, and when he came to the disciples, he saw a great multitude around them, and scribes disputing with them. There's a big debate going on, and a crowd's, and you can just imagine the shouting back and forth. And immediately when they saw him, all the people were greatly amazed, and running to him and greeted him. And he asked the scribes, "What are you discussing with them?" And one of the crowd, somebody just kind of steps out and answered and said, "Teacher, I brought you," that is to his disciples really, "my son who has a mute spirit. And whenever it seizes him, it throws him down. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. So I spoke to your disciples that they should cast him out, but they could not." Now, Jesus had given them by that time power to do that. But on this occasion, they couldn't do it. Now you can see why the debate's going on. Because they were trying to figure out why they couldn't do this. And maybe among themselves they're a little frustrated. You know how men are when they're trying to fix something. Here, let me show you how. You know how we are. But in steps the scribes, and they're probably finger pointing even more. So, you can't do it. And there's just this big debate going on. But this dad is just wanting his son fixed. Verse 19, and he answered him and said, "O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you? Bring him to me." And they brought him to him. And when he saw him, immediately the spirit convulsed him, and he fell down on the ground, and he wallowed, foaming at his mouth. So he asked the Father, how long has this been happening? Now, Jesus never asked questions to get information because he already knows. But he's letting the rest of the people around understand what's happening. So he asked the question to make them understand the severity of this. And the man answered and said, from childhood. It's been like this almost all his life. And often he's thrown him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. Can you imagine a dad just being there just every moment, just fearful of what might happen next and having to grab him and yank him out of the water or put a fire out or just... The power of Satan. I want you to see the power of Satan on these pages and understand how real it was in that day and time, and then recognize that same power exists in different forms today. We might not see the demon possession like we see in these pages, but we see the actions and the results of the actions of Satan in the hearts of individuals. Even in the Gospel, Matthew chapter 2, Herod, shortly after Jesus is born, meets a group of men called Magi. And they've come to worship the king. That gets the king troubled. So he says, well, tell me where he's at and I'll come follow later on. So he's expecting the Magi to come back and to pass the word on. But they don't, because God's warned them, don't go back that way. So they go back home another direction. You remember the story? And do you remember what Herod did? After he figured out they didn't come back and they weren't coming back, he sent his soldiers down into that area and he slaughtered every male child 2 years and under. The Scriptures don't say this, but you can imagine. And for years and years and years, in that town they talked about that. That was their 9/11. And the anniversary would come up every year and they'd remember those children that were just ripped to shreds at the hands of soldiers, at the bequest of Herod, by the power of Satan, trying to put to death our Lord and Savior. He has not stopped aggravating God's people on this earth. He has not stopped troubling our world and causing chaos. Peter writes in 1 Peter chapter 1, chapter 5, verse 8, to be careful of the Satan. Your adversary, the devil, is like a roaring lion, seeking whom he'll devour. And you turn back to the Old Testament, to that book of Job, very possibly the oldest book of the Bible, of one of the patriarchs that's not mentioned in Genesis. And God unfolds the pages before us and allows us to see what goes on when Satan goes after somebody. He's going to and fro, chapter 1 says. And he comes into God's presence and dares to step into His presence. And God said, what are you doing here? And he said, well, you know what I've been up to. You know how I am. I've been on the earth back and forth. God says, if you consider my servant Job. Now, Job's already been described by God as the very best man you could ever have on your side. Righteous man's the way God talks about him. He's the type of individual you want to have as your best friend. Covering your back, in your church, preaching your lessons, being the elder. He was the man that did everything right. And in the preceding chapters, Satan takes everything he's got. Steals his children right out from underneath him. Causes everything to be destroyed, and everything he had is gone within a matter of moments. And then chapter 2 unfolds, and then he starts after his health. And I want you to see the power of Satan as God is demonstrating to us all that. And now think about that and turn back to chapter 6 of Ephesians and look at verse 12 with me one more time. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers, and rulers of the darkness of this age, against the spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. That's your enemy. He is after us. The latter part of verse 11 says, be careful of the schemes of the devil. Not only is he powerful, but he's very scheming and plotting. He's looking to pick you apart piece by piece. He'd like nothing more than to take your heart out, just a piece at a time, and to steal your love, your joy, your family, anything you count as precious, and to just stand back and watch you in anguish and try to get you to curse your God. That's what he's after. Get a good image of him. Paul says, now I want you to understand that power. Now I want you to be strong in the Lord, in the power of His might. And you see the reason that Paul is telling us this. Because he's probably confronted a few of these demon-possessed people in his time. And he's seen that, and he's seen what he's done to churches, to Christians, to families, and to everything else. And, matter of fact, even as Saul, the persecutor of the church, he knows the dark side and knows how Satan does. And he puts all that together and he says, I'm shaking in my boots. You've got to have the Lord. Because you don't make this one on your own. Not the toughest guy out there. Know your enemy. I watched a snippet of a piece of information about Peyton Manning, and I really like that guy. Whether you're a Vol fan or an Alabama fan or a Georgia fan, Peyton Manning has got it together. Not only is he a good quarterback, not only is he a great quarterback, but he sits there and methodically watches those films time after time after time of all the teams he's getting ready to play. He knows exactly what each person does. He steps out on the field when he's getting ready to play, and he looks at the opposing team and he sees them lined up, and he knows what they're about to do. And he recalls the play because he sees what's happening. He knows his enemy. And he does that. Now here's the funny thing about it. Not from the worldly standpoint, but think about it for a minute. He does it to win a football game. And you can say, well, fame and money and family prestige makes his dad, Archie Manning, look good, and his brother Eli even, and his older brother who never got to play because of some strange disease that came in his life. And you can go on and on about all of that, but it's a football game. And he'll spend hours watching that, knowing his opposing enemy for that time. And it makes me think, if it's that important to win, what we need to be doing and making sure we're equipped in this fight to death, spiritually speaking, with our enemy who is out to take you down. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, spiritual hosts in this world. He keeps the curtain pulled too, so you don't see him. He lurks in places and does things and makes things so good looking to pull you away, to distract you, to steal you, to destroy you, to devour you. If that's the case, then I need my Lord. I need the whole armor. I need to understand what it says when it says, finally, brethren, when you're standing there that day and you're there by yourself, 2 feet on the ground, you better have the Lord on your side. You better be equipped. You better have every piece of armor in place. And understand that although we can see from the pages of the Gospels, Old Testament, New Testament, whichever, that Satan's power is destructive, God's is greater. But without Him, you're going to sink. You're going to be destroyed. The whole armor of God is what we need. We take up the whole armor, verse 13, that we may be able to withstand in the evil day. The times of temptations when Satan comes, either boldly in front of you face to face or lurking around and trying to just trick you. He'll do it any way he can. And then after having done all, it says at the end of verse 13, to stand. And then he goes on and describes all of these things that we need to have. But I want you to see the two superpowers here and understand that there is a greater power than Satan working out there. The power that's described in Genesis chapter 1 when the writer there says, let there be light, that it was there. Then the worlds were created and human being began because of the power of God. And all of those celestial beings that we don't know exactly how they came in being, you know that God had a doing in that. And only because of Satan's deceptiveness is he where he is today. But after us. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 4, for the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God for pulling down strongholds. I envision these arenas back in the days of old where they would throw these grappling hooks up over the top of the gates of this walled-in city and then just eventually just rip down the gates so they can charge in. And this is what I think is being described here when Paul talks about what we have with God. That the strongholds of Satan is nothing in comparison when you have God on your side. And you think, why in the world are we talking about this now? Well, we're studying through Ephesians, you can say. Yeah, that's true. But we're getting ready to start a new year too. And I keep inching my way closer and closer toward that. Sending out letters and reminding people and doing things to say, let's get ready. Let's make this life different. Let's make the year ahead different than before. Stronger than ever. More dedicated, more involved. Not more hours spent, because some of you are exhausting all your hours. I know that. And some of you aren't, and you need to be. Okay? I know we've got a variety of people here. But recognize what we can do as God's army, standing mighty with Him. There's another passage, a couple I guess I'd like you to think about here. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 8. For you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. Let's measure up, Paul says. You were once this way, but now you're not. Now behave like it. There's a challenge for all of us as Christians to make sure that we measure up, to make sure that we do what God expects us to do. It's right because of God. It's right as an example. It's right as a Christian. It's just right. And then there's another passage from Colossians now. Chapter 1, verse 13. As Paul is talking about what Jesus did, he said He delivered us from the power of darkness and then transferred us into the kingdom of the Son of His love. I can never think of anything more distinctly different than darkness and light, in hatred and love. That's what the power of God can do. It can change a heart. It can motivate individuals to do what they've never done before if the heart's open. There are two superpowers working right now. competing in your heart. One wants to destroy you. The other wants to care for you and take care of you and take you home. Don't underestimate what Satan's up to in your life. Remember the power of Jesus Christ and hold fast to Him. Look toward this coming year. Set goals in that direction. And even today, remind yourself who you are. And if you're not a Christian, being buried with Christ in baptism, you can be washed away of all those sins and belong to Jesus. If you've not done that, would you do that and be transferred out of the power of darkness and into the kingdom of the love of His Son this morning? And if you've gone off, then get back. We sing a song to encourage you to think about it and come while we stand and sing.